This is the Future Quake show. I am Dr. Future, and unfortunately Tom Bionic is not with us today. Dr. Future is going to be flying solo this week until Friday. Brother Tom will be joining us back for our tomorrow's Trimmers. But we have an incredible guest on this week. We have a Mr. William Grigg, who is the author of the Liberty in Eclipse book and has an incredible blog called Pro Libertate. And you can get to it at freedominourtime.blogspot.com. We'll have a link up at our website, but I want to cut to him because you're going to hear such a fundamental discourse from an intellectual giant in the household of faith that I want to jump straight to him. So we're going to cut away to my interview of William Grigg, and then we'll come back for a quick wrap-up. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're joined by William Grigg, the author of the Pro Libertate blog and a host of other media products. And today he's going to talk with us about the future challenges of our nation and the response and responsibilities of the Christian community. Mr. Grigg, it's the opportunity of meeting new, prestigious, and honorable brothers in the Lord such as you that makes this radio venture so worthwhile for me. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to brothers and sisters listening in that may not have been exposed to your wisdom, insight, and intelligence. And to begin our discussions today, could you give our listeners a brief summary of your background, experiences, and credentials up to where you find yourself today, including a brief introduction to your books and documentary films?
I really appreciate the opportunity as well, and I certainly hope that what we have to discuss today will be edifying to our audience. And I have to say that anything that I have to contribute by way of wisdom or insight is something I'm simply providing by way of synthesis. I wouldn't presume to say that I have unique or distinctive insights at any of these questions. I just try to be a good student. But with respect to my background in journalism and in media, for about 13 years I was a senior editor with the New American Magazine, which is a biweekly news and commentary journal published in Appleton, Wisconsin by the John Birch Society. And while I was working there for the New American Magazine for over a decade, I attended and covered something like a dozen United Nations conferences and summits, including the Population Control Conference. Actually, it was a summit because there were heads of state present in Egypt, in Cairo, Egypt, back in 1994. That was an experience that was sort of seminal for me in that it really alerted me to the fact that there was an attempt, whether it was something that was done by way of long-term design or I would consider misguided improvisation at best, to create this large cultural conflict between the West and the Islamic world. We were going to have trouble with the Islamic world anyway here in the West, but it seemed that there was a deliberate effort to exacerbate these divisions over matters that Christians would certainly find very inflammatory, having to do with family and the roles of the various types of families in both the West and in the Islamic world.
Mr. Grigg, can I ask you just real quick, when was that this occurred?
It was in August of 1994.
All the way back to 94.
Yeah, the Cairo International Conference Center there was only a few blocks away from some of the universities where a lot of the radical imams were organizing jihad against the West, and I thought that proximity was really quite symbolically appropriate, because one of the things that will make people angry enough in order to kill and die, if necessary, in order to kill their enemies, is the perception that their families are under siege. And so you had the West subsidizing and organizing these missionaries of the eugenicist worldview and the radical feminist worldview, and then setting them loose on the developing world, including, very conspicuously, the Muslim world. Here you have the capital of not just any Muslim country, but one of the more influential of them, Egypt, being used as the site for a UN conference on population control. And as a friend of mine, Majid Khatma, he's the head of a group in England called, I believe it's called Doctors for the Preservation of Innocent Life. He's a Muslim, a practicing physician who's a Muslim. As he said to me, you don't understand, in the West, from the Muslim point of view, God is the only population controller. And as I said, we were in for trouble with them anyway, but when you give them a plausible rallying cry having to do with the defense of their home and hearth and their families and their children, that will magnify the problems to where they become unmanageable. And so I came back from that experience in 1994. I was teaching Sunday school at the time, and I taught from the 29th chapter of Isaiah the Sunday after I got back. You made a covenant with death, and with hell you're at agreement. And I said, look, we're going to have a war between the Western world, such as it is, and the Islamic world within a decade, because we are consciously, by way of settled policy at the upper echelons of the United States government and the other Western governments, provoking these people by attacking their families. He said, yeah, I don't really have any brief about life. I certainly don't have a brief for their theology, but things were bad enough already. You don't need to borrow more trouble by doing this. But that was, as I said, really sort of a seminal incident in my life in terms of understanding some element of what's going on below the surface, the plate tectonics of politics, if you will. And then in 2000 and 2001, I attended a couple of conferences and summits at UN headquarters in New York. In 2000, they had the Millennium Forum, which was intended to bring about this union, or this wedding, if you will, between non-governmental organizations working through the UN's Economic and Social Council and the other elements of the UN system, to where you'd have this facade of democratic involvement on a global basis behind the UN's policies, particularly with respect to the redistribution of wealth. And then in 2001, they had the Small Arms Conference, or for lack of a better way of describing it, gun control or civilian disarmament conference at the UN that I attended as well. And by that time it had become pretty plain to me that the real problems that we were having with respect to the United Nations, which is a bad idea from the beginning, don't get me wrong. Anyway, you look at the UN in terms of its origins or its principles or policies, it's a bad idea. But the problems we were having with the United Nations had to do with the role it was playing as an instrument of policy from the perspective of people in the West who actually cut the checks, the major financial institutions behind the United Nations, the tax-exempt foundations that were helping to create policy through the UN, and the governments in Washington, D.C. and London and a couple of other Western capitals. The UN was primarily the threat that it was to our sovereignty and to our liberty and to Christian values, because it had become a tool of these Western policymakers. And if you sundered that connection, the United Nations would probably collapse beneath the weight of its own absurdity. But that was for 10 or 12 years with the New American. I would go to these conferences and summits, and I would go to other events as well. I'd cover, for instance, conferences of the American Bar Association having to do with terrorism. I went to a forum at the University of Illinois Chicago, which is where Bill Ayers, the notorious Weatherman terrorist, teaches. I think Bernadine Dorn teaches there. No, she's in Northwestern. But the University of Illinois Chicago in 1997 had a big conference on terrorism that was intended to be a training seminar for law enforcement from throughout the country. And in the opening session of this conference, you have a spokeswoman for the ATF throw up a PowerPoint slide of herself standing next to Yasser Arafat, and talking about how the ATF was helping to train Yasser Arafat's police forces, of which he had 5 or 6 at the time. He had this constantly expanding constellation of secret police forces. And this disclosure was made behind closed doors to law enforcement. It wasn't for public consumption. She wasn't aware that there was a reporter in the room. And this happened about a week after a horrific bombing had taken place in Jerusalem. And so I walked up to her afterwards and handed my card following her presentation and said, could you tell me a little bit more about that? And her eyes went agog, and she said, well, that's not the sort of thing that would want the public to know. And I'm thinking, well, obviously that's exactly the kind of thing the public needs to know. And through on-site reporting of this sort, it became clear to me that we're dealing here with a political structure, a political mechanism, an apparatus that is really designed to enrich certain people who consider themselves to be above and beyond accountability in ways that are injurious to the rights and the freedoms and the prosperity of the rest of us. It's really a feudalist system in a lot of ways. It's very cynical, it's thoroughly corrupt, and it's pretty much exactly the opposite of what our founding fathers had hoped that our country would have by now, in terms of an ordered republic ruled by a constitution that was intended to buttress a society ruled by God's law. And so that's something of a taste of what my professional background was like before I went independent in late 2006. I have also, in addition to the blog that you mentioned, Pro Libertate, I've been writing on a freelance basis for a couple of other publications, such as the American Conservative magazine, and doing quite a bit of radio outreach. I'd usually do 3 or 4 fairly significant radio interviews a week. And I've published 5 books. Most recently, my most recent book is entitled Liberty in Eclipse, The War on Terror and the Rise of the Homeland Security State. And that's been published through the Welch Foundation, which is an organization for which I work in the capacity of editor-at-large. I help edit some of their online and some of their other media offerings. And Liberty in Eclipse came out about 2.5 or 3 months ago, and it follows in the train of a number of things that I had done both at the New American and with respect to the video medium, documenting the rise of a lawless police state, although I don't like to use the expression police state. I prefer to call it a garrison state or now a homeland security state, because when people talk about a police state, they tend to miss a couple of very important differentia that distinguish a police state from a normal society, one of which is the militarization of the police and their conversion from an instrument of cultural peacemaking to an instrument of cultural oppression. I've lived in a couple of countries where the police are militarized and under the political control of a corrupt elite, and I'm seeing many of the same symptoms. Actually, I've seen them for the last decade or so, and they really have sort of flowered into their full malevolence during the last few years of the Bush administration. And trying to help people understand how we got to where we are and where we're likely to go is the point of this new book, Liberty in Eclipse. I'm working on a couple of other book projects right now, one of which would have to do with the prospect of conscription, which is a subject in Liberty in Eclipse that occupies the next to last chapter of that book, and some other things having to do with what's going on in the culture. And with respect to my personal background here, I'm married, father of 5 children. My lovely wife is named Corinne, and our 5 children are William Wallace, Isaiah Athanasius, Jefferson Leonidas, Katrina Antigone, and Sophia Faith. They're in ages, in descending order of age, from 10 to 3 years of age. As a matter of fact, Isaiah turns 7 in less than a month. And we live in a little town called Payette, Idaho, which is about 60 miles from Boise. It's on the western side of the state of Idaho. It's a community of about 7,000 people. We live here fairly close to my parents who live across the border in Oregon, and my wife's parents who live in Nevada. And we're all creatures of the western United States, both very much in terms of our cultural background and in our outlook on things. The western United States tends to be inhabited by people who take a little bit more skeptical view of the supposed benevolence of government than other people live in other parts of the country, I think.
Well, it's interesting. I was just catching the names of your children. It sounds like they have a common Greek connection. Are you anyway Greek in origin, or anywhere from?
You're the first person who picked up on that without my highlighting that fact. No, I don't know how it happened that we have 4 children with Greek names, either given names or middle names. Obviously, in the case of Isaiah, Athanasius is a Greek name. Mm-hmm. It was suggested to me by a friend who's a Roman Catholic, and the thing that I like the best about the biography of Athanasius, or Saint Athanasius as Roman Catholics refer to him, is the fact that he was indomitably committed to the truth as God had given him the wisdom to understand it, in spite of the fact that he was a minority of one at one point. And his famous statement was that one man with the truth is a majority. And I was just so taken with that I thought it's a pity I can't actually name our son Athanasius, but we'd chosen Isaiah for his name. And it's appropriate. Of our 5 children, Isaiah, who turns 8 in July, as I'd mentioned, is probably the one who's most interested in the Bible and the one who's most passionate about things having to do with God's rule and God's kingdom. And then Jefferson Leonidas, of course, Leonidas was the one who led the 300 Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae to hold off the Persians. And Leonidas was somebody I'd long admired. And as I was writing my my third book, Global Gun Grab, the expression "molo nabe," or "come and get them," had become something that I'd been quite taken with, because a lot of the gun rights activists use that as a way of expressing their defiance in the face of the gun grabbers. If you want our guns, you're going to have to come and get them. And of course, "molo nabe" was the famous call of Leonidas and his Spartans in the face of the Persians. You know, if you want our weapons, you're going to have to come and get them.